Hello and a very warm welcome to British Guy Reacts. It is so great to have you. Now today I'm going to do something a little bit new. I'm going to react to a history of Canada. So as you all know, I'm fascinated by American history. I thought Canada would be a really interesting counterpoint. Obviously it has a lot in common with the United States. It's a result of European colonialism. It shares the same landmass. But also there are some key differences. So Canada broke away from its imperial master peacefully, whereas the United States did by violent revolution. Canada is officially bilingual, whereas the United States, in practice, I think is pretty mono. I know it's got a big Spanish-speaking population, but they don't have the same sort of legal protections that the Francophones do in Canada. So yeah, I think this should be really interesting. So go get yourself a cup of maple syrup. Remember to be nice to everyone because this is Canada and we've got to do a few stereotypes. And let's watch the video. Canada, looking good. Looking big.
Canada, known for their delicious maple syrup.
Of course.
And being home.
And I've got to say, I am a huge maple syrup fan. I mean, if that was Canada's only contribution to human civilization, and I'm pretty sure it's not, but if it was, they would already be one of the greatest countries in the world. So yeah, maple syrup, good. If you take nothing else away from this video, make it be that.
To nearly all of the greatest hockey players of all time, is the second largest nation on Earth, and with approximately 2 million lakes, contains over 50% of the freshwater lakes on the planet.
Oh, wow.
For many thousands of years, this region was populated with many indigenous tribes of hardy people, capable of overcoming the severe and lengthy winters, thriving and developing unique cultures. The first non-native people to settle in Canada.
I mean, it'd be really interesting to know more about like the relations between these different kind of First Nations. I mean, I presume they formed alliances, fought wars, traded with each other, and also kind of like to what extent were they culturally distinct? I mean, I'm assuming that across the whole of what is now Canada, there was a lot of cultural variation. But yeah, if anyone knows any videos about that kind of stuff, please do post in the comments, and I'll go and check it out.
And the New World in general that we know of for sure were the Vikings. They built a settlement in Newfoundland around 1000 AD.
And that is crazy. So, I mean, the Vikings made it across to the New World in longboats or longships, which are very narrow, about 450 years before the first European explorers from Spain, Portugal, and Italy. And that is just crazy. I mean, the fact that they managed to establish settlements that early, I've got a bit of a grudge with the Vikings because they burnt down half of England. But on this point, I've got to give them kudos.
It is unclear for exactly how long this settlement was occupied for.
There
was more.
I'd love to know.
Ultimately, it was either abandoned, pillaged, or its inhabitants succumbed to disease, or assimilated into the local population. But theories abound. Nearly 500 years later, in 1497, the Italian explorer, Giovanni Capoto, was the first European to explore North America's coast, claiming it for the English crown. Shortly after, the Spanish and the Portuguese would do the same. But
I mean, that's European colonialism in a nutshell, isn't it? What one country makes a claim, and immediately 2 or 3 more countries turn up and also make claims. Then they fight. That's basically what happened on about 4 different continents.
Remained uncolonized for several decades, with only a few seasonal Portuguese and Basque fishing outposts built, until the French arrived. Jacques Cartier claiming the land for France in 1534. He named the Gulf and river after St. Lawrence's feast day on which he arrived. The French called the territory around the river Canada, after the native word for settlement. After several failed attempts at permanent settlement succumbed to starvation and disease, the cities of Quebec and Port Royal were successfully established.
Okay, I love how in these pictures, Quebec is a sort of portrayed as like a sort of stone city, whereas Port Royal is like a wooden shack. I'm sure that doesn't reflect what they're like at all these days, and was just sort of reflective of the first settlement. But yeah, that kind of amused me.
By 1670, the English colonies in the south had expanded, and new settlements were established in Newfoundland and south of the Hudson Bay. The fur trade, particularly in beaver pelts, became extremely lucrative, as it became the favored material for hat makers and luxury winter clothing in northern Europe. This greatly encouraged further northern settlement by both English and French fur trappers, seeking to make a fortune. The French and the English did not peacefully coexist, but the French
I mean, you can end virtually any sentence about world history with the phrase, the French and English are not peacefully coexist. That almost goes without saying. I mean, just to save time from now on, I think we'll only mention it if the French and English did peacefully coexist.
Temporarily taking much of the territory around the Hudson Bay during the lengthy period known as the Beaver Wars.
Bit rude.
Not only the Europeans became wealthy and influential from the trade in beaver pelts. The Iroquois Confederation of 6 powerful tribes, armed with European firearms, initially allied with Dutch merchants, and then the English, to aggressively attack the French.
So, does this mean that the influence of the Iroquois extended into Canada? Because if so, I mean, I always associated with New England, but perhaps their reach was much greater than I thought. Perhaps they were more mobile, or perhaps their area of control was bigger. No, that's really interesting.
Most other Indian tribes in the region to obtain more furs. Many of these tribes banded together with the French to halt Iroquois expansion. Peace was negotiated after 72 years of fighting, and many, mostly Indian lives lost, and little territorial change.
Sad.
The region of New France was comprised of several colonies. Canada and Louisiana were the largest, along with the smaller Plaisance and Acadia, which the British Empire obtained from the French in the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 in a complicated agreement concerning the War of Spanish Succession.
The Treaty of Utrecht is famously incredibly complicated about absolutely anything. If anyone understands it, they are superhuman, because it was pretty crazy.
France also recognized the legitimacy of the Hudson Bay Company's claim over Rupert's Land. Interestingly, the Hudson Bay Company is still in existence today, primarily as owners of a retail store chain bearing their name, despite their larger.
That's a come down, isn't it? You go from colonizing a new continent to owning a retail store. That's interesting. I mean, it is fascinating how much of a role private companies played in European colonization. So not just in Canada, but obviously in India or in Indonesia, for example, we had the Dutch and the British East India companies. Which have their own armies, and I mean, whilst they're still very much attached to their kind of parent country, they're also somewhat independent. It would be like sort of Google having its own army and claiming territory all over the place. I mean, maybe SpaceX is going to do that, so the parallel might be repeated.
Territory. The French increasingly became outnumbered by the rapidly growing British colonies surrounding them, by a margin of 10-1 by the time the next major conflict between the two.
So this, I think, is really key as to why the British won in both what is now the United States and in Canada. It's for some reason, I don't totally know what it is, but for some reason, British migrants were much keener to move to North America than French migrants. Perhaps the weather or the food is worse in Britain. But I mean that does seem to be key, because in the 7 Years' War, the British colonists just had a lot more resources than the French colonists. And it's kind of, the other thing that makes it a bit weird, I think France had a higher population than Britain at the time. So I don't really understand why that was. If anyone knows, I'd be really curious.
Occurred during the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, as it has become known in much of North America. French-speaking Acadians were deported far from the Canadian borderlands, some of whom formed the basis of much of the Cajun population of modern-day Louisiana and New Orleans. Both English.
I've heard of this sort of population in Louisiana who are still very culturally French. I don't know if they still speak. I'm guessing they don't speak French as a first language, but they still have quite a strong French identity. And it's the biggest sort of French identifying community out of Quebec. It would be a fascinating place to visit.
English and French empires sent thousands of regular infantry to North America during the war, supported by local militias and Indian tribes. The greatly outnumbered French relied heavily on Indian allies and fought the British to a standstill early in the war, until the British successfully besieged the cities of Quebec and Montreal.
So I mean, the Battle of Quebec, which is it's kind of famous or semi-famous, certainly in UK military history. It was fought outside the city rather than actually in the city. It only lasted about an hour, and both the generals, both the commanding officers of each side died. So that the British were led by a guy called James Wolfe, who was shot several times. I don't know who the French were led by, but I do know whoever he was, he died.
The French later defeating the British in a pitched battle. They failed to retake their capital city. In the treaty that ended the war soon after, France ceded Canada to Britain, while giving Louisiana territory.
So that's devastating.
Spain. It is important to note at this time much of North America's non-coastal areas were still largely unpopulated, with many of the native tribes heavily depleted through warfare and invasive diseases from which they had little immunity.
I mean, so I think what he's basically saying is that, on the map, Britain is claiming it owns all that, and Spain is claiming it owns the bit below. But in practice, other than a few settlements, much of it was probably not really under their control. It was probably under their control in name only, I think it'd be fair to say.
With a population of approximately 3 million, the American colonies waged a successful rebellion against the British Crown.
As we saw in our last video,
the Americans attempted and failed to take Quebec, which remained loyal to Great Britain. After the war, many British loyalists moved north into Canada. During the following war...
So, I mean, certainly from my understanding, that was very key to kind of the foundation of Canadian identity, but particularly to Canadian identity as distinct from American identity, as in the kind of the American loyalists moving to Canada, and therefore having a much stronger attachment to Britain. And so certainly, like, had that not happened, you have to wonder whether Canada would have been anything like as friendly to Britain for as long as it was in our timeline.
War of 1812. Both British and American armies launched several failed invasions of each other's territory, ending in military stalemate, and the status quo was maintained. The treaties following the war established a more formalized border between the two nations. Despite the Canadians' desire not to join their American neighbors to the south, movements for self-rule increasingly grew among the Canadian lower and middle classes, culminating in the rebellions of 1837 and 38. That were severely dealt with and crushed.
That looks like it's being dealt with fairly severely. I mean, judging by that picture, like, both sides look like they got semi-professional troops. So, I mean, I'm assuming it was quite a serious rebellion. I don't know the details. But it would have been really interesting if I don't know if there was a movement in Canada to join the United States. I mean, certainly, the United States Manifest Destiny, there was for a very long time an interest in incorporating Canada. I don't know if any of these rebel movements had any sympathy for that idea, but it would be fascinating if so.
And saw the short-lived Republic of Canada established by William Lloyd Mackenzie. Despite the Republic's short-lived lifespan and its immediate size, widespread
that's like the definition of a micro country. It's sort of like Sealand, which is an oil rig somewhere off the coast of Britain, which has declared independence, has about 5 people living on it. That's the definition of a micro country.
Not only from many Canadians, both French and English speaking, but also from Americans to the south, spurred Great Britain's government to make major concessions in the rebellion's aftermath.
So I think this is a crucial point. So we saw in the last video on American history how, in response to unrest and protest from the 13 colonies, the British government really dug in its heels, didn't concede, was a really hard line, and the result was a full-on armed rebellion. By comparison, in Canada, when there was some unrest and lots of protest, the British government made big concessions. And I guess that potentially stopped a Canadian revolution along the lines of the American Revolution. So it's a kind of an interesting... I mean, perhaps they almost sort of learned from the American experience.
The Act of Union in 1840 united Upper and Lower Canada into the new province of Canada. And the granting of responsible government soon after allowed for a far greater degree of self-rule to be exercised by the elected representatives of the people. In 1846, the disputed Oregon Territory was peaceably...
I want to know who Rupert is, because apparently he owns a lot of land, and I'd like to speak to him and see if he'll give me a little chunk, perhaps about there.
...divided between Great Britain and the United States, pretty much by drawing a straight line and giving Vancouver Island to Canada.
So this was the big the Oregon dispute, which was actually quite serious for a while between Britain and the United States, but obviously was settled peacefully.
Throughout the 19th century, a massive boom in the logging industry fueled large waves of immigration to Canada, gradually replacing the fur trade as Canada's most lucrative industry. In 1867, the British North America Act, or more commonly...
In terms of Canada's population, like, even to this day, the vast majority of Canada's population lives pretty much right across the American border. I mean, if you go, I'm not quite sure about the exact distance, but if you go kind of like 70 miles further north, it becomes very low populated. So I mean, it's fascinating that Canada remains, all the Canadian population centres, for obvious reasons, are very much to the south, and obviously much of Canada, which is an enormous country, is almost depopulated to this day.
called the
because it's
Constitution Act
freezing.
established Canada as a self-governing democracy, with Ottawa as its capital city. To the west, the Hudson's Bay Company negotiated the sale of Rupert's Land to the newly formed Canadian government. The Métis people, of mixed European...
I did not know. So that's kind of like how the Americans purchased Louisiana and Alaska. It seems Canada was able to purchase Rupert's Land from a company and a British company rather than a foreign power. But it's interesting how much territory was changing hands in North America for money during this time.
Primarily French and Indian ancestry, were the largest population of the Winnipeg area of what is now Manitoba. Fearing the land they had held for generations would be seized by newcomers from the east, they rose in rebellion, creating a provisional government. And after a tense standoff, an eventual occupation by federal troops, many of their demands were met, respecting their rights. The leader...
Honestly, I know very little about these Canadian rebellions, because it seems they were actually sort of fairly substantial. So I definitely, when this video is over, I'm going to have to go and Google them, because I'm slightly embarrassed that I've kind of heard of them, but not in any depth.
Of the rebellion, Louis Riel, would lead another larger but less successful rebellion 15 years later.
Because that looks like quite a battle.
And execution. Louis Riel became a martyr, or villain to many Canadians. His death increasing the tensions between Indian Métis, English, and French groups in society. Because of the key role the partially completed transcontinental railway played in the suppression of the rebellion, political support for completing it soared among English-speaking Canadians, and the railroad was completed in only 4 years from when it had begun.
I mean, in both the United States and obviously, as he's saying, in Canada, railroad technology played such a big role in sort of almost keeping the country together, in facilitating trade, in unifying what at times have been quite a disparate set of states in the case of the United States. I sometimes wonder what would have happened without the railway to North America, and I think its politics would be very different.
The 1890s saw the Klondike Gold Rush, in which over 100,000 prospectors set out to the remote Yukon region in hopes of striking it rich. Some did, but most didn't. After several decades of stagnant population growth, largely due to emigration to the United States, Canada's population sharply increased due to a good economy and high foreign immigration throughout the early 20th century. During the...
I'd be very interested in knowing where this immigration was coming from, because by the look of things, it was quite varied. I presume there was still a lot coming from the British Isles, but presumably it was also coming from other parts of Europe, even other parts of the world. I'd be really interested to know kind of like how the demographic breakdown, if it worked.
The First World War, Canada, still a dominion of the United Kingdom, sent 620,000 troops to fight in Europe.
620, that is insane. Like, I don't know what Canada's population was at the time, but I'm assuming it was much lower than it is today. It would have been much lower than it is today. That is just crazy, the number of soldiers they sent. I know they played a key role in lots of battles around sort of Passchendaele, Vimy Ridge, I think is a particularly kind of famous Canadian battle. But yeah, such a huge contribution.
7,000 would die, while another 173,000 would be wounded. The staggering casualty rate grieved and shocked the nation. The war had a strong impact on Canadian nationalism and the desire to self-govern its own international affairs, which they obtained when the British Parliament passed...
So that's very similar to Australia and New Zealand, where their experience in the First World War played such a role in the development of their kind of national identities as being distinct. They stopped seeing themselves as basically British settlers and started seeing themselves as Australians and New Zealanders. So kind of how the Anzac suffered at Gallipoli, for example. It's really interesting that something similar seems to have happened with the Canadians. I mean, at this point, Newfoundland wasn't actually part of Canada. It was a kind of a separate dominion within the British Empire. So thinking about it, that number of soldiers that Canada sent presumably doesn't include the Newfoundland contribution. And if you look at sort of World War II memorials, I've seen quite a few in northern France, in Belgium, they normally list the Canadian dead and also the Newfoundland dead, and essentially treating them as different countries at that point.
The Statute of Westminster in 1931 which acknowledged Canada's co-equal status with the United Kingdom. Between the World Wars, Canada was hit particularly hard during the Great Depression of the early 1930s, with unemployment rates reaching 25%, and many men living in unemployment relief camps. During the Second World War, over 1.1 million Canadians served.
Yeah, okay, Canada, you're more than doing your bit, Canada. 1.1 million. The number of soldiers that Canada provided in the two world wars, in relation to its population, is crazy. Like, I don't know. I'd love to know, but did Canada provide a large number by relation to its population than Britain itself in the Second World War? Because like 1.1 million people serving, that's for what would have been a relatively small population. That is incredible. So yeah, kudos to Canada. I knew it wasn't just maple syrup you contributed to human civilization, taking down the Nazis as well.
In that brutal conflict that left nearly 100,000 of them.
Oh, no, on D-Day, of the five Allied beaches, 2 were American, which was Omaha and Utah. 2 were British, and 1 was Canadian. So that shows the extent of the Canadian participation. They're their own beach on D-Day.
Dead or wounded. In 1949, Newfoundland became the last Canadian province to incorporate. In 1965, Canada adopted its current flag. Here's a selection of some of the other national flags that were proposed. Let me know in the comments.
Honestly, I think they made a good choice. Like, some of them, number 3 looks like a corporate logo. Yeah, I think I like the Canadian flag. I think they made a good choice.
Which one do you think?
Needs more maple syrup.
In 1982, the Canada Act passed the Parliament of the United Kingdom and was ratified by the Queen, granting Canada the right to create their own constitution, which they promptly did.
I mean, it's nuts that Canada was theoretically, I mean, not in practice, but in theory, still partially subservient to Britain up until the 1980s. That is just wow. I mean, obviously, the constitutional links still exist. I mean, Canada, the Queen of Canada and the Queen of the United Kingdom are the same woman. But that the kind of the formal sort of overlordship, well, that's overstating it, but Britain having some kind of say over Canada, in theory at least, wasn't ended till the 80s is, wow, just crazy.
Still recognizing the constitutional monarchy in a mostly ceremonial rule, the new constitution abolished the British Parliament's remnants of influence over Canada. Canada is now a nation of over 36 million people, where over 20% speak French as a first language, and has the 10th largest economy in the world. The province of Quebec has maintained a strong French influence over the centuries, and has on 2 occasions voted in referendums to decide whether Quebec should proclaim national sovereignty and become an independent country. In 1995, it very nearly did not happen.
Yes, both the referendums were quite close, and I think if there's any Canadians, you might have to correct me on this, but I think one of the referendums actually kind of the outcomes deciding in a court case. That was how close it was. So I mean, Quebec came very, very close to becoming an independent country. But interestingly, support for Quebec and independence has actually fallen quite a bit. So kind of the more recent polling, it's less popular than it used to be. Though obviously there's still a lot of tension between kind of Francophone and Anglophone, or Francophone and Anglophone Canada, over language and over sort of certain cultural issues. So Francophone Canada is very secular, like France, and I know that's produced some tensions in recent years with less over certain religious symbols.
With secession still being an issue till this day. This has been Epimetheus. Let me know.
Well, that was really, really interesting. I say there was a lot I didn't know, so I learned a lot, especially about some of these rebellions, which I only vaguely heard of. I mean, as I say, it's fascinating. It definitely seems to me that the UK making concessions to Canada was why Canada didn't end up in a kind of US-style revolution. Which again raises the question that if Britain had made similar concessions to the American colonists, would the American Revolution still have happened? But I think there's really interesting questions. I mean, Canada and the United States are 2 countries that are both very similar and very different at the same time. But anyway, I hope you found that interesting, or at least tolerable. I'll settle for tolerable. Thank you for your time, and I hope to see you next time.